Hey guys, Jack's your free auto mechanic. Today I'm going to show you how to replace and install a four-wheel drive hub bearing on the front of this pickup truck right here. Sometimes you won't even know when these are actually failing from the lights that's coming on. What you'll notice is when you go to stop, it'll roll an extra 5 to 10 feet, and this is the cause of that. Once you replace this, it'll take care of that and go back to working as normal. A workaround for temporary use is you can unplug the fuse for the ABS or the relay, and it'll just stop hard and it will no longer allow the ABS system to work. But enough about that. Let's get down to replacing this thing. First step is to jack up the vehicle, take the wheel and tire assembly off of it, and then we'll take the brakes loose so that we can remove the rotor and give us access to the hub bearing itself. There's 3 bolts on the back side of it that need removed, and the center axle nut as well. So I've got my wheel off, I've got it jacked up, and I went ahead and I rotated the wheel so that it gives me a little better access to the back side of the caliper mounting bolts. And instead of just removing the caliper, I'm going to remove the entire assembly. And to do that, you need an 18 millimeter. There's just 2 bolts. There's one right here on top, and then there's one right on the bottom as well, right down here. And we're just going to remove both of those bolts, and this entire assembly will come off. These bolts are kind of tight. If you don't have an impact, you can use a breaker bar. That's what I use to break them loose. And then you can switch back over to your regular ratchet. Something you might need to do is to spread the brake pads apart so it'll come off of the rotor a little easier. And you can do that just by inserting a screwdriver or a pry bar. Should give you enough play. Allow you to take this off. And just set it up out of the way. And this will allow you to take the rotor loose. Again, just set that off to the side. So you might notice that this looks a little different than what yours might, and that could be just because I don't have the rest of the dust shield on here. And this one is rusted off. I live out in Snow Belt, Southern Ohio, and it is rusted, gone, it's missing, but it is required. So I will be replacing this whenever I put it back together, and I'll put you a link to all the parts that I put on here, the hub bearing and the dust shield as well. But you do need it for the space between the hub bearing and the steering knuckle. So don't leave that out, don't lose it, don't break it off. You'll need to hang on to that because you'll need it. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the axle nut. It's a 36 millimeter. And if you do not have an impact, an option that you can use before you take the brake rotor and your brake calipers off is you can have someone hold their foot on the brake, and that'll allow you to take this loose without it sitting there spinning. Now that we've got our nut loose, need to remove it and the washer behind it. Set that to the side. Now, fortunately, my axle shaft seems to be loose. If it's frozen, you can spray WD-40 in there. They do make an air tool that drives this out, or you can put something in here, a screwdriver, whatever you have, and use your persuader to knock it loose and free it up. But next thing we're going to do is going to remove the 3 bolts that go on the back side. You have a bolt here, one here, and one on the other opposite side of this one to remove. They're 15 millimeter, and this is going to be your hardest one to remove. The reason being is you've got this ball joint in the way. I like to start with the easier ones first. And you don't have to take it all the way out because we're removing the hub bearing assembly. You just want to get them loose so that they're not bolted on. You've only got about that much thread holding it in. Now I'm going to go to the other side, but I'm going to have to rotate that so that I can have enough access to get to that bolt. Now I've got access to the bolt on the other side. I'll go ahead and take that loose. Looks like I'm going to need a short extension. I can get a good fit on there. Same thing, doesn't have to come all the way out. Next we're going to move to the top bolt. And like I showed you before, you really can't get in there to it too easy with a socket and a wrench, or a socket and a ratchet, so I'm going to get a wrench. You can put another wrench on the end as an extension. I like to use my persuader just to break it loose. You can see it's definitely not coming out, and we're not going to worry about that. As long as your axle shaft's free, next thing we got to do is break this loose. Now I have on occasion put a bolt back in a couple threads and tapped it with a hammer, and you do that on the different bolts, and it will start rocking the hub bearing itself out. They do sell a hub bearing puller, that you use a slide hammer with, and it mounts on, and you use the slide hammer and it applies pressure and works its way out. Or I've used an air chisel and put it in between the two and got it to work itself out. But what I've found works the best, like I said before, is just tapping on these bolts, the 3 bolts, and it rocks it loose. Now you're throwing this hub bearing away, so you can smack right on the bearing if you need to. And when you go to remove the hub bearing sensor, it's hidden back behind here, and it's just clipped in. You'll unplug it, and then you'll need to remove the wiring that's just shoved in. It's got a little slip tab on the back side of this. Then we'll want to unhook here, follow it down, unhook it here, and then we'll also need to pinch this so that this will pop loose here. And that's all we need to do for that. That takes those 2 loose. I'll fish it out from underneath my caliper. And the only one left is this one. So that worked. Let's pry it off with a screwdriver. Now that we've got our ABS wire disconnected, the only thing left to do is to get the hub bearing off. And like I said before, since you're replacing it, you're not going to hurt it beating on it or tapping the bolts. You can see I've got a gap here. So it's moving, it's working. And you may need to rotate to the other side, do the other bolt, then go back and forth a couple of times, whatever works for you. If you want to get a pry bar in there and start trying to pry it, you can do that. There's no wrong way of removing it. We'll get to this side, do the same thing. I just run the bolt in a couple of threads and just tap it. And like I said, if you need to rotate back and forth, or if you can get a pry bar in there and work it with your pry bar, then that's okay too. As you can see, the pry bar is working for me pretty good. Sometimes just a little wiggling. And the only thing that's holding mine in is the bolts that I put it back in. And if this is all you have, you need to hang on to that, because you're going to need that as a washer. kind of work it a little bit, press on your axle shaft some, and it should slide right out. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to clean up the rust on the flat surface and on the inside surface, as you don't want to have any rust in between your old shield pieces or your new dust shield. I'll put a link to the new shields down below in case you need a set, but you can use some sandpaper, a Scotch-Brite pad. You just rub it down real good if that's all you need, with some WD-40, or if you've got some air tools, if you've got a zip wheel, go ahead and use that. Knock off all the dirt and the dust. Now that we've got your surfaces clean of any kind of big rust chunks or debris, you want to put your dust shield on. If all you have is your old pieces, then you'll have to use them. I've got new ones. Again, I'll put a link down below in the description. You want to make sure that you put these on right. You might feel like they go on this way, but they don't, because they'll rub your rotor. This lip will go on the inside, so they'll set on just like this, and then you'll get your new hub bearing. And something else you'll notice, you've got these nubs that stick out, and they'll fit right in these nubs on the plate, and your cable that comes off your ABS sensor is going to go through the dust shield. So you'll want to make sure that you've got that going through it whenever you go to install the hub bearing itself. It might seem a little tedious, and it can be at times. But you can set it together like this before you slide it onto your axle shaft. So it should look like that, and then you'll want to get your 3 bolts started on your hub bearing. And the top one you want to start, I usually start first, because you've got your ball joint nub that comes down in the back. And once you get your 3 bolts in, then you can go ahead and tighten the hub bearing up. If anybody wants to torque them down, I believe it's 133 foot-pounds of torque on these bolts. And when you put your axle nut on, it's 177 foot-pounds of torque. But for now, let's just go ahead and get our 3 bolts started. Once you get your 3 bolts started, then you can go ahead and tighten them up. And that'll pull it in nice and snug. as you're tightening them up, you can switch to your different bolts so that it pulls it in nice and straight. Now we tightened up the 3 bolts. We want to go ahead and put our washer and nut back on. And like I said before, you want to tighten this up to 177 foot-pounds of torque. For now, you just want to run your nut as tight as you can get it, because you can see you're not going to be able to try and use a torque wrench unless you put a pry bar in there and try and hold it or you're working the torque wrench. There's no reason to do that. We can wait till we get the wheel back on and just lower it back down so that the tire is holding it in place. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reroute the ABS connector, connection wire, what have you, just like when we took it apart. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing. The tabs push through, but they want to come back through on the bottom, so I'm just bending it open just enough so it keeps it from pulling back through. You can see our new ABS wiring harness already has these clips in place. But instead of trying to fight these off, I'll just remove the new ones. And then we want to make sure that this gets plugged back in. Now, similar to the other, this slide piece is still in place. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And since the old one's still in there, hooks together like that. You want to make sure that you get everything secure, because you don't want that wire flopping around in there, getting into something it doesn't need to. Now we have the hub bearing secured. We've got our new dust shield in place. We've got our ABS wire connected and plugged in. Our next step is going to be to put the rotor on and then reinstall the brake caliper assembly. And if you haven't checked your brakes recently, that'd be a real easy time to do that. We'll slide that on there. We'll get our bolts. And at this point, you want to put some thread locker on your bolts. Doesn't have to be a lot, just enough that it's gonna prevent them from backing out. And we'll go ahead and put your 2 bolts back in. It's not always easy to line up the bolts and the caliper, but just try to get it where it was before. You get one started, I usually try to do the top and then move down to the bottom. And you can just kind of wiggle it around till you get it in place. We'll go ahead and take our 18mm and tighten those up. And next step, we're just going to put the wheel back on, lower it down, and then we'll put a torque wrench on our axle nut. And something I want to stress to you, or remind you in any case, is that whenever we took this apart, we did put a pry bar inside the caliper, and we pressed those brake pads in just a little bit. So before you go moving the vehicle, you want to make sure that you pump up the brake pedal before you even think about taking it out of park. Now we got our caliper on there tight. Rotor's in place. Next step is to put the wheel on. Alright, now we got our wheel on. Now we need to get our torque wrench. We're going to set it to 177 foot-pounds of torque. Once you get it set, make sure you hear it click. We'll put our cover back on. Now we've got the axle nut torqued down. We've got our center cap put back on, our wheels on. You want to make sure you remember to pump up the brake pedal before you test it out. And if you had bypassed the ABS system by removing the fuse or the ABS relay, now would be a good time to reinstall those before you go test it out. For those of you that were like me and did have to bypass your ABS system, you can use the inside panel to locate. It says ABS, that's the 60 amp fuse. And all I had done is pulled it out and just set it off to the side. So now that I've done the repair, I'm going to go ahead and plug that back in before I take it for a test spin. If you need the parts, I'll go ahead and put a link down below where you can purchase them, both the hub bearings and the dust shields. Also, if you haven't hit the subscribe button by now, please go ahead and do that. I appreciate you watching.